Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another film discussion on the Jams and Tea channel. Zach and I are back again with another discussion of a relatively recent and really exciting new movie, in our opinions, one that we have a lot to say about. 2 weeks ago, we hit you with the discussion of Ryusuke Hamaguchi's Drive My Car, and we're back again this time talking about an American production that is the new film from Sean Baker, Red Rocket. And as soon as I heard about this movie, I mean, obviously, I'm a huge fan. Well, not obviously. Our viewers may or may not know, if you follow me on Letterboxd, that I'm a huge fan of Sean Baker's previous work, particularly his last two films, Tangerine and The Florida Project. And so I eagerly awaited this movie. So I awaited the opportunity to see this movie once I found out about that it existed in the first place, because as some of you may know, a lot of Sean Baker's movies are shot and filmed and created and released without a lot of fanfare, because Baker directs and crafts films in a very sort of unique and kind of low-key way, as I'll get into. But for those of you who haven't seen the movie, and this will be I think a relatively spoiler-free discussion. I don't think that there's much of the movie that we're going to talk about that isn't like baked into the premise of it anyway. But if you don't want to hear about any narrative details, then this won't be the discussion for you. But we will tread, with reasonable levels of care when we talk about the details of this movie. But essentially, it is the story of an aging porn star named Mikey Saber, who is returning after 17 years in California shooting porn films to his hometown of Texas City, Texas, I believe. And essentially, he is going through a period of financial instability. He's kind of washed up, burnt out, no longer the star that he once was, although there's a certain level of kind of unreliable narrator kind of qualities to his history, in the sense that you kind of just have to rely on him telling the truth about his level of fame and esteem, although there's also, objective evidence that he presents to characters within the film. But there's a certain sense to which his actual background and his actual level of success is kind of nebulous. So we're introduced to him at the point in the narrative where he is returning home, where he's essentially homeless, looking for a place to live, goes to the house of his estranged wife, Lexi, who lives with her mother, Lil, both of whom are played by non-actors, I believe. In fact, Mikey Saber himself is played by Simon Rex, who's the only professional actor, I think, in this movie, at least certainly.
And he's known for like the Scary Movie franchise.
Yeah, exactly. He's known for a kind of like a lowbrow history of sort of film acting, and a lot of that the stuff that he's been in is like 2000 stuff as well. So there's a certain sense in which, on a meta level, Simon himself is kind of like, I want to say washed up, because that got an inherently negative connotation to it, but like this is sort of a career revitalization for him, and probably the most significant and sort of serious role that he has ever played. And he performs the role brilliantly. His performance is sensational. But anyway, as Mikey Saber, he begs essentially his estranged wife Lexi to take him back so he has a place to live. And essentially what you see throughout this movie is this character of Mikey Saber ingratiating himself into the lives of people around him and essentially manipulating them in any way to get whatever it is that he feels he needs, he feels he deserves. He's a very curious character in the sense that he's not directed in this two-dimensional way so that we see him as this purely kind of like narcissistic sort of evil doing kind of sort of really kind of like low rent seedy guy, but he is that. But at the same time, like, Baker directs and writes this character so that he has like a genuine sort of charm and likability and weird sort of like a goofy sort of sense of humor. And he's, there's an interesting tone to the way in which this character is portrayed while doing and sort of crafting the most kind of abhorrent behavior that you possibly could have a protagonist do in a movie like this. So from the outset, you have this very fascinating, but also kind of deeply discomforting character who, as the movie goes on, the manipulation of the people around him that he sort of conducts and that he sort of does gets more and more kind of seedy and uncomfortable. He develops a fixation on a teenage server at a donut shop and he becomes convinced that she could be a porn star, and that by kind of introducing her into the world of pornography, it could be his own kind of way of stepping back into the limelight and into sort of success. And so you see him pursuing and seducing and kind of like worming his way into this young girl's life more and more and more. And so, yeah, and as you could imagine, if you haven't seen it, that makes for situations which are, incredibly sort of difficult to watch at certain times, and incredibly difficult to sort of tonally balance as well, because this is a movie that puts this character front and center. So, Zach, at this point, I'm curious.
Often wearing no clothing.
Often wearing no clothing. There is, I will say,
directly center stage, bearing all.
Yeah,
running through the night.
There's a very satisfying level of full frontal male nudity in this movie. But yeah, Zach, you've come to this movie fairly recently, as have I. But what was your take on this film? What was your immediate sort of response to it, as a person who I know feels pretty positively about Baker's previous work, as I do? What was your immediate response to this movie?
So, emphasis on immediate. I finished watching this movie about half an hour ago. So it's extremely, extremely fresh in my mind. This is one of my most anticipated films of the year. I particularly adore Sean Baker's film Tangerine, and I really enjoy the Florida Project as well. And when this debuted at Cannes, one of my friends went and saw it. And so I've kind of had this expectation of, this movie being pretty provocative and fun and interesting and cool in the ways that I've grown accustomed to with Sean Baker. I think what immediately pops out to me with this movie is its regional specificity. As you say, it takes place in Texas City, Texas, which is a coastal town. It's kind of near Galveston. It's like right on the Gulf of Mexico. So it's like right kind of on the ocean. And it also takes place in the year 2016. It actually kind of takes place at a really specific time in 2016. It's set during, like, you said it was filmed in 2 weeks. It's actually kind of cute to me because the film takes place over a 3-week period, basically, more or less.
What's funny about the shooting time and the setting specifically is that it was shot in October and November of 2020, and it's set in October and November of 2016.
So there may be a little bit of a time lapse, because I'm thinking the 3-week part of it is when he meets the character Strawberry, and she's like, my birthday's in 3 weeks. And so like that part of the film is 3 weeks long. There may be a longer period of time before he meets her, because there's a specific event that happens on the news that happened in July of that year.
Sorry,
and
it's earlier.
And the reason that sticks in my mind is because the event happened in July of 2016 in Dallas, the month before I moved here. And it's just like a little detail in the news. There's just like a lot of really nice little peppered in period detail and regional detail. And the reason that that's important to me is because what Baker kind of does with his camera is he makes these images of the town very expressive, very cinematic. They don't really look like taking a normal picture in Texas City, Texas, but they look recognizably like that place rendered in this kind of, I hazard to say, beautiful way, because what I'm thinking of is particularly those opening shots of Mikey, the Simon Rex character, walking into the town, and there's like this oil refinery behind a fence, and it's like billowing smoke, and there's this great little smokestack that like shoots flames, and it looks like one of the things from like the opening scene of Blade Runner. So it's just like this dystopia exists constantly in the backyard of these people's homes. And Tyler, you might think that this is like a lofty comparison, but it reminds me of like Antonioni. Like it reminds me of, so the whole movie, I was kind of getting like a Wes Anderson vibe, because he loves Sean Baker. I mean, there's like all these saturated colors, and there's kind of like a two-dimensionality to some of the shots where things are symmetrical or framed in shapes in ways that are creative. Not every shot is like that. And it reminds me of the Italian director, Michelangelo Antonioni, whose films are very aesthetically driven to kind of be ugly, to kind of represent this industrial ugliness to the world, which I think that this has in spades. And what it trades from Antonioni, who is sort of like the spiritual emptiness of the bourgeois, this movie's kind of like the grind of the lower class American and like what it is to live in this place that's like the biggest game in town is an oil refinery that is literally destroying the entire environment. And everybody else is just like in these little pockets, these little tiny homes where they're struggling to get by and scrape by and stuff like that. And I think that like that as the setting to the movie that you're talking about with these complicated characters is really interesting because it lends credence to what you're saying about the main character of Mikey not being two-dimensional, because he's like this guy that has lived a version of the American dream. Like he got to go and like fuck a bunch of hot women in Hollywood and like be famous and make a bunch of money. And then he lost it all. Like it's just like, it's a parable about how that dream is facetious and no one ever really changes classes in this country. And I think that there's like a lot of really, really, really sharp commentary on certain types of experiences in America and the way that this character's like very specific particular fame kind of haunts him wherever he goes, and like the way that your job kind of becomes your identity and how those types of things can become inescapable, particularly when they become part of your external persona and your reputation and stuff like that. And how easy it is to get kind of caught in that as a person. I also think, and this is one of my favorite things about the Simon Rex performance and the direction of it. Did you get the impression that his character had like ADHD in particular?
Definitely.
Yeah. Which I thought was kind of interesting. Like it was, I know that I just finished it. There's just like a handful. There's like a part where he's like in the arcade that kind of gave me that vibe. There's something really early on where it just like, he just kind of has these little, it's when they're at the donut place and he's like walking way ahead of them and stuff. He's just like on his next grind. Like he's just like ready to go on to the next thing at any given moment.
And not even that as well. Like there are several moments throughout the film, some quite key to the narrative, where he just acts very impulsively as well. And like in a way where you can sense, and it's beautiful because it's so pitched beautifully through Simon Rex's performance, in a way where you can sense that this is not like part of his, he doesn't necessarily have this kind of grand plan. He has kind of ideas that come to him and he kind of moves from one sort of like spur of the moment thing to the next. He goes without intention into this next sort of situation and then just tries to kind of figure it out as he's going. Like he just relentlessly rolls forward. I've seen some comparisons actually between this movie and the movies of the Safdie brothers, like films like Good Time and Uncut Gems in particular, where you have similar kinds of performances that are pitched in similar kinds of ways with similar kinds of manic energy, where you have a character that you are essentially trapped with for an extended period of time, and the anxiety and tension of the film comes from their unpredictability, the kind of questionable nature of their motives and morals. I think
there's like an internal, when I watch like Uncut Gems, there's like this internal quarrel of like, do I want the protagonist to succeed or do I want the idiot to get burned for being an idiot a little bit? You know, there's like that as a viewer where you're like, this guy's doing a tightrope walk and I can't quite tell if I want him to make it or if I want him to fall and break something at any given moment, you know, because of the nature of his character.
And it's slightly different and slightly more complicated even with this movie, I think, because I think unequivocally, at least from my perspective, I would hope from most people's perspective as well, there's not really any doubt in my mind that I do not want, what's his fucking name? Mikey Saber. I do not want Mikey Saber to succeed in any of the things that he is trying to do when he is in Texas City. Well,
I don't know, you know, I have all right. He does plenty of like really ethically gray to bad things. I'm not saying he doesn't. I feel like I was somewhat primed for him to be like Captain Scumfuck. Like he was going to be this, just everything he did was terrible. And I was like, you know, he's a manipulative grifter and so is everyone around him. Like, it's kind of a movie about how there's never any sort of solidarity between any of these people. They're always just sort of in tension with each other. They're always kind of trying to one-up each other and get one over on each other. And he's an engine of that, but it exists before and after he arrives, I would say. He is no more despicable than his environment, and he is certainly a product of his environment. And I don't want to like moralize about that, but it's just sort of like there isn't anything that he does in particular outside. There's one thing that involves like a hit and run fleeing the scene of an accident thing, which is like a part of the movie that I'm still digesting, which I won't. You said we don't want to spoil, so I guess we won't get into that. But it's like, other than that one thing, everything's sort of like, ooh, this dude's scummy. But I never really. I'm trying to think like, okay, so in the movie Tangerine, the character of Cindy like goes into places and drags people out of them and like beats the shit out of them. That to me is like, that's that. And he just like nothing that he does that's like on that level at any point to me. So it's like, there's like, to me, this is good because it complicates his character, because it's like, he's always sort of pushing the limits of what you're going to find acceptable or what people are going to find acceptable. And he sort of rides this wave of charm and this kind of like outsider homegrown celebrity status that he has among people to kind of like get his way and things like that.
Yeah, I feel kind of similar but different. Like throughout the film, like, and I think this is what's, and I think it's complicated and interesting in a slightly different way, and that's that this is like an unequivocally sort of despicable person who is doing like some pretty unequivocally despicable things. That said, like Baker clearly, and this is what makes Baker's films so charming, and this is what makes him such a great sort of imaginer of character and director of character as well, is that he clearly has affection on some level for every character in all of his movies. Like he clearly has a deep-rooted kind of empathy and understanding of each person and of their motivations. And I believe he sees Mikey Saber in a not dissimilar way to kind of how you have just sort of portrayed him, as this product of his environment who has these kind of warped images and ideas of the people around him and these motivations that are very kind of like morally gray. But what makes Red Rocket so thorny and interesting is, yeah, you probably have lots of movies with those kinds of characters, with that kind of character dynamic, but there's a particular kind of like sharp sort of difficult, ugly sort of potency to this movie, because the kind of behavior that this character displays in this movie and the things that he does, like I think strike a particular nerve of subject matter that I think is particularly sensitive in a time where there's increasing and growing awareness of sex workers' lives and experiences, and the ways in which the sex industry can and often does prey on young people and is incredibly sort of predatory and violent industry in ways that are kind of becoming more and more visible. And so there's a kind of real sort of topicality to the movie that's definitely not something that's a new thing for Baker, but in particular, having this very complicated character who's very charming and very funny and who gets into these situations that are painted tonally in this very sort of goofy way. That the juxtaposition between that kind of goofy tonality of the movie and of these scenarios that he's in, and really kind of like thorny behavior and things that he's actually doing, like there's a kind of juxtaposition there that makes the movie like kind of a tense experience in a way that's kind of more pronounced than I've ever seen in any of Baker's previous movies. And it gives the whole experience of the movie this electricity in terms of like my emotional and psychological response to it as it's going on, that makes it like in a similar fashion to those kind of Safdie brothers movies that have been evoked as comparison points, in a way that's not dissimilar to those sorts of films as well, but obviously in its own kind of unique, with its own kind of unique feel and its own kind of unique subject matter.
So I think we've made a couple different filmmaker comparisons. One that we've not made, but that I think about a little bit, is Steven Soderbergh. And I think about Steven Soderbergh because Sean Baker and Soderbergh have each made movies on iPhones, like on cell phones, talking about like Tangerine, Unsane, High Flying Bird. And then there are just certain other little things. This movie's interests are probably most similar to like Magic Mike, I guess, because it's also about the entertainment industry, the sex work industry, blah, blah, blah. And it's also a movie that I think brushes up in a lot of different ways with capitalism, more directly in Magic Mike than here. But I still think essentially here, and the reason that I bring that up is because to me, I don't see how trying to incentivize a girl from Texas City, Texas to go to LA to work in the pornography industry is all that different than convincing that same girl to become a drug dealer who sells weed in Texas City, Texas, or any of the other types of dead end things that there are to do in Texas City, Texas. This is a town where in this movie we don't even see that they have a Walmart. You know, they've got like a little tiny grocery store. This is a town where there is no future. Your future is you can go to Dallas and try to make the whole city thing work, or question mark. And it's like, to me, like, I get what you, I understand what you mean. And I do agree that there's like this sort of tension because the character in question is 17 going on 18. And there's like a question of not only the age gap between her and Mikey Saber, but also just sort of like, is that grooming? And there's all these different questions. But to me, it's like, there's a conversation that they have where she's like talking about, I can't wait to hit this point in my life and then leave. And he's like, why not just do it now? And I think there's an earlier point in my life where I would have heard him say that and been like, oh, that's repulsive. And I hear it now and I'm like, yeah, why not? Just get the fuck out of there. There's nothing in that city. It's dead. Like, there's no future there. And so I find it kind of complicating that it's like, I look at her potential to like go and have this particular career path, because as we know from the perspective of people living in now the year 2022, there's not just like working for Brazzers, you can have an OnlyFans page. There's all types of different sex work that you could go and do in LA that isn't really vicious and evil. And I think that that's a really important part of Sean Baker's almost objective perspective on his representation of characters in the sex work industry. While there is this complicating tension, and while there are these kind of, while there is attention paid to the environmental circumstances that draw people into that world and the complicating nature of that world, it is done without judgment, so as to say that like not everybody's experience is the same as Mikey Saber's. Part of the deal with him is that he's kind of an irresponsible jackass, and not everybody that's in the porn world is an irresponsible jackass, though probably lots of them are, you know. And I think that it's really important to be able to kind of draw those sorts of neutral observations out of this as well, because there is plenty of criticism for American culture, and I would say like the American dream and certain things about capitalism and the behavior of this character. But I also think that it presents selling cannabis as a financial opportunity that is, you know, that can make a person independent. And that's illegal. You know, that's illegal in a way that sex work isn't illegal. That's illegal in a way that like him having the sexual relationship with a 17-year-old isn't. There are these kind of, they're not really posed as questions within the script, but they're just juxtaposed against each other.
Yeah.
Where it's like things that are morally taboo and things that are illegal, but not really morally taboo, not really seen as that bad.
And it circles back to Baker's kind of interest in that sort of subtextual commentary on capitalism, right? Because yeah, I can definitely see where you're coming from with regard to like that encouragement to just kind of get out of the town and go to the city and like just try and do something. So there's that kind of
I wouldn't necessarily recommend going with this guy.
No, for sure. But there's like that kind of vision of it. And then there's the reality of specifically what Mikey is offering, which is to take this person into like a particular kind of, you know, heavily structured and like heavily sort of capitalistic institution to have their autonomy sort of stripped from them. And
I think it speaks volumes that he can only think of pornography in terms of the one industry that he had been successful in, and that he has no sort of even though he's such a hustler, he has no real imagination for like what the future of the industry would be. And I think when you release the movie in 2021, when you make the film in 2021, you understand that the porn industry has evolved already from what it was in 2016. So I do think it kind of speaks volumes to the fact that he's kind of in the final scene of this movie, there's a needle drop of a song that is played at the beginning, and it's played in reverse. And to me, it's kind of like, yeah, he's just gonna, like, it's just a cycle, just like this guy kind of rambling. Kind of reminds me of the end of Mike Leigh's Naked, just a little bit.
Yeah.
Where it's just like, and he just like walks on to his next adventure. He's gonna go do some more scandalous shit, probably.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And as with like a lot of Baker's movies as well, like the narrative development, Baker has a tremendous way of like telling these kinds of stories, and instead of deftly avoiding, I would say not completely avoiding, but for the most part doing a really good job of avoiding most narrative contrivance and also most kind of cliche as well. Because typically in a movie sort of based around a character like Mikey, there are like, at least a dozen different points in this film where in a lesser movie or in a more conventional movie, you would see Mikey get rolled, you would see Mikey get rumbled, you would see him kind of run up against some kind of significant barrier. And yeah, you have the kind of
he would become more two-dimensional. He would commit like a greater dopey act, and like the script would punish him really severely for it. He'd be all depressed in the shower.
Whereas
this doesn't really mess with that.
Whereas in this movie, you can be like in the kind of home stretch of Act 2, and he's having sex with a 17-year-old on a public beach. Like he's
okay. So I love the cinematography of this movie, and that's one of my favorite shots of it.
The crash zoom.
It's like specifically like in reverse. It's like a pan out. It's like you see him and it pans out. It's like it's so extra. The formalism in this movie is like just nuts, the way that it's edited. There's so many insert shots of people fucking. It reminds me of Shame just a little bit. Like it's not got the same angle on the sexuality, but just the way that it'll be like, oh, also, but
I was reminded of sort of Borat at points as well, like just in terms of that way that it's shot, and just in terms of like the sort of intimate and uncomfortable nature of the way that you're kind of linked to this person. But
I think there's two movies from this year that this is similar to. One of them is Licorice Pizza. The predominant things that are there are sort of like the two romantic interests being separated in age, and then also the male being like the script kind of revolving around his various schemes and plots, which is how Licorice Pizza is. And then I think it's also this is a field. This will only be for people who have seen this, but it's similar to the Romanian movie Bad Luck Banging, and the similarity to that movie is the use of sex as like a jarring kind of like that. Here, you're watching the movie. Are you awake? And then also the way that it particularly comments on, that's another movie that was made in a very short period of time. And it's like that one's set in 2020. And it's just really all about confronting contemporary issues. And I would say conflating all the different ways that Romanian culture, and in this case, American culture, are fucked, and then talking about how much more seriously we look at sex as a moral issue. Because, and it's just like a quintessentially American thing. It's like the world is on fire and we're worried about like the dude doing porn. Just the priority schism in, and it's just a movie that kind of has that peripherally all throughout it, at least in my opinion. Like when you have scenes of him applying for jobs and people being like, I'm sorry, we can't hire you to be like we can't hire you to make $9 an hour doing the most menial task imaginable because like you had sex with people on film. It's like, nah, sorry. And it's ridiculous, but it's how it is.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a really like unpacking that taboo, I think, is a really big driving factor in what I think is interesting about Sean Baker's work, because I think that like in Tangerine, you have characters that are incarcerated for having done sex work, and it's something that percolates all throughout that script. In the Florida Project, like kind of the thing that sets that climax into action is a character getting busted for sex. And it's just like, he's always kind of poking at different taboos and going like, why do you react to this one more than you react to this one? And I think that that's a really smart way to kind of, would you call this a satire? I think it's funny enough to be one, but I don't know if it's pointed enough to be one.
I think you could fairly apply that label. Yeah, I think that there's sort of elements of the comedy as well that are like broad in ways that feel like in the tradition of satire. So I don't think that's an unfair thing to call it. It's but obviously, you know, being a Sean Baker movie, it's a little more complicated than that. It doesn't come with the kind of like snarky postmodernness of satire in the last 20 years. It's kind of more it's satirical.
It's a better movie than Don't Look Up, you're saying.
Well, yeah, like there's certain aspects in which it is like satirical, but like it's also a movie that has a lot of like, for lack of a better word, heart in it. It's more of like a character study of where, and this is the thing that for me, when I see allegations of like quote unquote poverty porn leveled at Sean Baker for his movies and the focus on people in the lower classes and their kind of experience and that sort of thing, the reason why I find that to be somewhat untenable is that without fail, like these films are always primarily, before anything else, before satire, before like, I don't know, cinema verite or whatever, they are character studies of characters who are drawn with incredible levels of depth and detail and humanity and three-dimensionality. They are tales that are conceived in conjunction with, you know, people who have the first-hand experience with the situation or with the, you know, the world that the film is depicting. I mean, you can go back and look at Tangerine for a beautiful example of that and the way that that movie was made. So to me, I think there's a certain extent to which I think often people, and I'm sure not exclusively, like I'd be happy to engage with some rebuttals of Baker's work from people who, you know, are actually have actual firsthand connection to the world he's depicting. But I see a lot of people kind of coming out against what Baker does, like conceptually, and they're often coming from a place of privilege where it seems to me like they're just kind of uncomfortable with seeing these movies in the first place, or just uncomfortable with the world depicted in these movies, and often quick to assume that it must be in some way exploitative or unfair because, you know, it can be grimy, or it can, like, you know, set out a morally gray sort of, or like ambiguous, it doesn't, like, you know, outright, a character like Mikey Saber is not like outright condemned, or is not like given this really broad, cheap sort of like psychological, you know, explanation for why he is the way he is, or anything like that. People are used to looking for those sorts of things, and popular cinema, you're used to being fed those sorts of things, and Baker doesn't do that. And so the situations that Baker depicts, and the level of kind of nuance and thoughtfulness with which he goes about doing them. I mean, there's a reason why this movie is over 2 hours long, and I wouldn't cut a single scene from it. But there's an extent to which he does that, and I think some people don't quite like. I don't think are fair in the way that they use this criticism. I mean, I'm curious what we've kind of already kind of broached it in both of our discussions of this movie, but I wonder if you have any additional thoughts on like how tenable these accusations of exploitative storytelling that Baker does is.
So I think there's sort of two issues at play. One of them is about depictions of unethical behavior and like not giving the audience a clear black and white sense of morality. And to that, I just say, like, yeah, that's how you should tell stories. Like, you shouldn't spell things out for people unless you're making like a Star Wars movie and the whole point is like more about good and evil having a sword fight for the fate of humanity or whatever's happening there. In a general way, I kind of don't really buy into this idea of like the character needs to be condemned throughout the script. And on the topic of scripts, talking about the second thing where it's just sort of like, is he exploitative of lower class characters? I would say that I completely agree with your sentiment that as a screenwriter, I think that Sean Baker is really considerate of all these characters. He makes them complicated and challenging, but as I've already tried to say, like, not over the line in a way that suggests that their cartoon characters are monstrous. They feel like dimensional people who make both good and bad and neutral choices, who do things that have consequences. And he's, as a storyteller, really interested in how confrontations unfold within human interactions. And he's somebody that's like really particularly interested in like high strung kind of, I don't even want to call it drama, it's more like just like tension. But that always kind of comes from a place where, at least from my experience, it's interesting how you can detect the specific perspective of any given character in a scene, and you can trace the source of their conflicts emotionally. I think that there's another criticism worth approaching that has the most validity, though, which is about the aesthetics of his films. And that's this. From like Jump Street, from the beginning of filmmaking, I think that there's a necessary question to ask, particularly in like documentary filmmaking, about the line between when things become exploited and when they aren't. To be completely frank, filmmaking is a privileged art. It takes a lot of money to do it, even at like the most independent, small scale level. We're talking like millions of dollars. It's just not something that you can do for cheap. And thus, I think it is beneficial for us as members of the audience and filmmakers themselves and whoever else to ask the question of like, is what we are doing appropriate? Because I do think that when you're talking about, productions that cost millions of dollars representing these types of people, that you put forward something that is honest, that is, I don't want to say that it has to be like helpful or like that has to be like aspirational and great and all that type of stuff, but just something that puts forward like care, that understands that your relationship as the filmmaker has a great impact on the things that you put in front of people. And I think of documentaries like Paris is Burning or Streetwise, which are like American documentaries from late 80s, early 90s, which are like the pristine examples of how you depict these types of, and those are documentaries, so they're not characters, they're real people, but like with grace and with empathy. And the real key to all of it is this, that poverty should not be the identity of your characters, right? And I think that we've covered that as a screenwriter, he does that. What's interesting is that his style is not stripped back, it's very stylized. And that's where I think a lot of people kind of get this discomfort. I think that this was like a criticism levied at Nomadland from last year as well, where it just doesn't necessarily have like a neo-realist, super detached documentary style. But with Baker, with his digital filmmaking techniques, with the like immediacy of the way that he will shoot a film, he's still like bringing in this sense of realism, like a grounded sense of realism that is kind of stretched and morphed and stylized, which I can understand thinking that like that specific part of it, taking this type of character and then building a story off of it that's kind of like visually expressive and then like designed to be kind of comical and goofy. I could see how that could come off as exploitative. But then everything about the writing begins to kind of, in my opinion, inform all these different choices, where it's just sort of like, I just watched a movie called Z, and it's one of the most politically active, politically charged movies I've ever seen. When you listen to the director talk about it, he's like, you have to remember, when people go to the movies, they want to be excited. Like they want to enjoy themselves. They want to like enjoy what they're watching. And I think that that is something that Baker keeps in mind. And it's like creating these types of psychological tension. You're like, I don't really know how to feel about what's going on. And it just kind of makes the experience entertaining. It makes it visually interesting. And in my opinion, puts forward a depiction of sex workers, of the lower class, that is complicated in its honesty, which is all you can ever really hope for in a movie of this nature. When I watch it, the character of Lonnie, the neighbor, who's like that, I've met that person. Like I know that guy. I've met him many times. On that topic, you had talked about like narrative contrivances. I think that's a really important part of these depictions too, is that like the screenplay is not like this really brutal mousetrap to be like, ha ha ha, I'm poking at these characters. It's just sort of them going about their daily lives. The event with Lonnie, the traffic event, which I've already talked about, that's kind of like the most contrived screenplay thing. It's probably my least favorite part of this movie. Like it's just something I'm kind of still digesting. Did you have any thoughts about that? Did that hit you in any kind of way? Like that little event?
It is sudden, but I don't think I have a significant issue with it. I think that it's kind of like, it feels like, though it's a little blunt in terms of how it acts as a narrative device, it feels like you have these repetitious like sequences where Mikey and Lonnie are hanging out, and Mikey is using these hangout sessions in various ways as ways of kind of like boosting his ego essentially, and kind of like giving himself a sense in which his credibility is being like reinforced. And even though it's like quite hilariously just like this one dude who like doesn't matter and like has this kind of quite sad sort of desire to, I guess, bask in the perceived glow of Mikey. And so there's a tragedy in what happens with that character. But I kind of like the nature of it is kind of like, it fits in with the sort of like goofy and sort of slightly absurd nature and stylized nature of parts of this movie. I found it like darkly funny and also like really sort of sad as well by the same token. But eventually also the way that it sort of serves as another example of how Mikey essentially sort of gets away scot-free, at the expense of this person that he's exploited.
And is like
to me,
super pumped about it.
to me
Like,
that works as a kind of like, you know, mirror to his relationship with most of the other characters in the movie as well, particularly his relationship with Strawberry.
I had a thought. So there's an exchange that he has with Strawberry, and I think he has it with one other person as well. I forget, maybe Lexi, where they're questioning why he, as the male actor, gets like an award for an oral sex scene. And they're like, the woman's doing all the work. What the fuck did you do? And that's the character, in my opinion, where he's like, no, you don't understand. These are all the things that I did. And there's like a validity to what he's saying, both in that story and like in his character. Like, he does good work for the family of drug dealers in theory. He provides for Lexi and Lil in theory. And he's like, look at all the good shit I'm doing. It's like, yeah, because we gave you a place to stay and because we gave you a product to sell. It's like, you do good when people give you good things, and you don't do anything when no one gives you anything because you suck, you know. And that's kind of the character a little bit to me, where like he's always barking about all the, it's a movie where, you know, like, okay, so you watch like Noah Baumbach's Marriage Story, and that's a script that's like really, really dedicated to giving you like both sides of every single thing that it talks about. It's a very symmetrical piece of writing. This is a movie where you get one side of every story, and it's Mikey Saber's side, where like he just runs his mouth about Lexi the entire time. And it's like, I bet if Lexi were in this car, she would have some things to say about the way that he describes what went down when they went to LA together. That is not entirely accurate from her point of view.
There's an amazing scene late in the movie where he arrives, again, I don't want to spoil it, but like he arrives home, and this whole scene is just sort of one static take, and he's telling her about his new plans that don't involve her, essentially. And she performs the scene brilliantly, because she's just like completely stone-faced the entire time, and there's just this unbelievably like tense but also like utterly hilarious tension between the two of them, as he's trying to like, you know, just convince himself that things are okay between the two of them, purely by just kind of talking it through while she says nothing. And that's just absolutely like the heart of this movie, and one of the most beautiful sort of, or like, you know, perfect scenes in terms of like exemplifying what this character is and what the movie is giving you in relation to him and the people around him, right? This single perspective.
There's a great scene that's kind of in the middle of the movie. It's when the character of Strawberry is introduced, the very scene. Basically, Lil and Lexi are like, Mikey, we're gonna kick you out because you said you were gonna pay the rent and you're not paying the rent. Like, what's going on? He's like, I want to pay the full amount of your rent, blah, 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 blah. Let's go get donuts. And they go to Sean Baker's favorite place in the world, the local donut shop. And I love his acting. I love Simon Rex's acting, because it's like, he goes from being kind of like excited, and he's like, we're part of the family and everything's good. And then he sees another girl and it immediately goes away. It's just like gone. The affection's gone. And every scene, like, well, that's not true. He continues to have sex with Lexi until he has sex with Strawberry. And then it's like gone there too, which is so like, this is kind of dirtbaggy, but like, it's true. Like, I don't know if you or anybody that's listening, if you've ever sort of like been hooking up with somebody and then you meet somebody who you like a whole lot more, it's like, oh, you're just dead to me. And it's like, the way that he does it is like horrible and tactless. He really doesn't even do anything. He just sort of slowly moves away from the situation. Like,
there's just like, this is the comedy of this movie, though. It's the same as that scene I was just talking about, where like he flips and his motivation changes, and all of a sudden, like, the comedy is him. Like the comedy before was in like how he was like racing to get them to the sort of donut store to like really prove his love for them by like encouraging them to spend as much money as they want. Then his motivation changes, and it's about getting them out of the donut store and home, and it's again when he's as quickly like walking as possible. Way in front.
Like, where are you going? Why are you walking so quickly?
Yeah, and just getting on the bike, and it's just so.
He just immediately, he's like, oh, I gotta go get like cigarettes. And they're like, we have cigarettes. Like, I gotta go get rolling papers. Just bicycle.
It's so good.
It's like this recurring bit where he doesn't want Strawberry to know where he lives, and so he keeps having her drop him off in like this wealthy neighborhood. Which is like a great little thing where like that comes to a halt in a very Texas way, where the person comes to the door with a shotgun.
Yeah.
And it's like from that point on, you're like, how is he gonna work this out? Which is like a lot of the appeal of the movie.
Yeah.
Best regional Texas thing, I gotta say it because I'll forget it if I don't say it, is when he first goes to Strawberry's house and she's like, do you want a Coke? He goes, yeah. And she hands him a Big Red, which is like a regional type of cherry. It's not cherry, it's cream soda. And so like in America, people call soft drinks different things based on the regions. Like some people call it soda, some people call it pop. But in Texas, for some reason, everybody calls everything Coke. So it was just like a nice little piece of like Sean Baker did his regional research, and like it's like, yeah, that was a Texas character moment. Good stuff.
Yeah.
I love things like that. Obviously, you can only ever really pick up on them if you've been to places, but I like when filmmakers like don't just use a place as a setting, but actually kind of get to know it a little bit, which I think is important because this is the framing of the story is like this guy comes back to his hometown. So it being so kind of like granular in that type of detail, I think is important to making it feel like an authentic version of a homecoming story.
And that's the movie. Let us know at home what you thought of Red Rocket, what your take on the movie was, what your take on Sean Baker's filmmaking style and his movies in general is. We want to hear from you in the comments below. We love to read your comments and we love to interact with you. So please make sure you remember to do that. If you enjoyed our discussion, please hit the like button, really helps us out. If you enjoy what we do, hit the subscribe button if you haven't done that already. That also helps us out too. If you want to support the channel in a bigger way, you can hit the join button, and for just $1 a month, you can support us and get your name featured in the start of every single video. Make sure you remember as well to go and check out Zach's podcast, the First Watch podcast, which is available wherever you get your podcasts. Zach and a guest, sometimes multiple guests, will talk about movies on the regular. I think we're going to be involved in recording some episodes for that, I guess, soon as possible, really. So there'll be plenty more coming in that department. Don't worry. But until then, as always, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Big Red, deliciously different.